hello and welcome to the Club Life podcast. I'm Darren Flynn, the Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at Clubs New South Wales, and it's great to be back after a few weeks away. And who better to get back into the swing of things with than a true doyen of the club industry? Danny Munk started his career at Granville Bowling Club in the late 1970s before moving on to Parramatta Leagues Club, Epping RSL, Guildford Leagues, Balmain Leagues Club, Panthers Penrith, and finally his current home of West Illawarra, where he's been the CEO since 2015. It's been quite a journey, so let's jump right in. Danny, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Darren.
Danny, we just listed all of the clubs that you've worked at throughout your career, and with the exception of those two short tenured stays at Granville Bowling Club and Epping RSL, every single club where you've had a significant stint has been a Leagues club. Was that something that you did by choice, or was it just a coincidence?
Look, after Parramatta, I think I felt comfortable in that environment. Rugby league was something that I quite enjoyed personally. And I think the way the Leagues clubs approached sport and community sort of sat with me. Not that I had anything against the journey in the RSL or bowling clubs, but I felt more comfortable within that space. And even now, that environment that we focus on younger people, sport, development of junior league, development of sport both for male and female, is something that comes quite naturally to Leagues clubs.
And Danny, I think in the early days, a career in the club industry was probably not on the cards for you. Is it true that you were originally interested in a career in the military?
Absolutely. I had actually hoped to be in Duntroon, but as it turned out, an allergy to penicillin is not something that the military find attractive. So suddenly I had a career change. Ended up in the ATO while I was doing my initial studies. Probably didn't see myself fitting in the public service long term, but it certainly was a good start to the journey. Where I initially did accounting studies and then moved over to economics and then completed that while I was at Parramatta.
And probably similar to the club industry in the sense that the ATO, there's a very long tenure for a lot of the people who've worked at the ATO over the years.
Yes, and they also knew how to drink too, so there was commonality there.
Now, what about chemical engineering? Because you dabbled in that briefly as well.
Yeah, Sydney Uni, started off at Chem Eng. Enjoyed the environment, but once I realised that most of the more attractive personnel were in the arts, engineering didn't seem to be that more attractive to me, but also too wasn't probably the natural fit at the end of the day.
It's probably a good segue into your time in the club industry, because it's when you were first introduced to clubs, working at Granville Bowling Club whilst you were studying back in the 1970s. Tell us about working in the club industry in the 1970s. It's a very different industry today. What was it like?
Well, firstly, it was very hands-on. I've got to say the rules were a little looser, but it was all about people, and it was all about making sure that you provided support. So the age, needless to say, of the membership at Granville Bowling Club was certainly more senior, but it was all about entertainment in the evenings, food options in the evening, and sport in the day. And your role during the daytime was to make sure that when the breaks were happening in the bowls, you were ready to pour the sevens. I can't imagine asking any of their staff now to chain pull sevens the way that we were taught. And in the evening, it wasn't a case of you were serving middies or schooners, you were serving jugs on trays. Everyone was dancing, everyone was having a good time, and it wasn't difficult to fill a room because clubs were part of the major entertainment community focus.
And was it that time at Granville that convinced you to make the full-time transition into clubs?
It probably was part of the journey. I really enjoyed the people. I enjoyed the people that I worked with, but I also enjoyed the people on the other side of the bar. There was a lot of interaction. You found customers who would talk to you about life and journey and so on. And I ended up at Parramatta through a friend and really enjoyed not only what was happening at Parramatta, but at that time, Parramatta was starting to be a premiership team, and the energy around that and the behaviour both within the club and outside the club created an environment that you wanted to be part of. And I was quite lucky that I was provided an opportunity to take on the catering as a catering manager. And considering it's not something I was trained in, I had a gentleman, Reg Elkleton, who was the CFO at the time, who certainly was a mentor. And we both took that role on, and eventually it was made a permanent position. That would have been around 83. And from then on, really management in the club industry was always going to be the long-term career.
You mentioned that early 1980s period for Parramatta, obviously the golden age for the club even today. What people, younger people in particular, may not realise is that Parramatta were enormously unsuccessful in the earlier part of their history. Tell us about the excitement in the area and around the club indeed in the early 1980s.
It really is hard to describe what it was like. One, it was a different world. Up till the point where Dennis Fitzgerald had got Jack Gibson on board, they had a lot of young talent. Parramatta always had young talent, but it just never seemed to melt. When Jack Gibson came along, there was a change in the club. And you could also sense it the way people were being attracted to the club, coming, spending time, because the team itself not only represented a strong rugby league team, but it represented Parramatta as a successful city. It changed the tone of Parramatta. Parramatta went from being a poor cousin to suddenly people talking about it as another significant metro. And in turn, as the team started becoming successful, people wanted to rub shoulders. So the nights were busy, the food areas were busy, but when they won the grand final, it was my first experience of truly uncontrolled chaos. You couldn't get into the club. The streets were blocked, to the point that you also couldn't get out of the club. I basically found myself literally living in that club for 2 to 3 days. You just had to keep going. It's something that would be very difficult to do today, but it was an experience that was worth living through.
And you wouldn't hear similar stories today, but of course on the night of the 1981 grand final, the Parramatta fans, so the story goes, burned down the old grandstand, which was set to be demolished for construction of the Parramatta Stadium anyway, but burned down the old grandstand. Did you have a bird's eye view of that from the club? Or
Certainly a bird's eye view, and it's interesting that so-called no one has been deemed responsible for that. And, you know, there was a lot of politics around that. But also, too, that then led to the journey of the building of the new stadium. And as part of that, I was involved in setting up the catering and the private boxes, which was a whole new experience as well. So the journey at Parramatta was a great learned experience.
Some milestone years for the Parramatta Eels Football Club, but also a big milestone for the industry early in the 80s. I think it was 1982. When not long after I first started at Clubs New South Wales, I went out to Broken Hill and met with the board of the Broken Hill Bowling Club and said, how's business been lately? And they said, it's been tough since the branded breath testing came in. It seemed like a bit of a joke at the time, but it was a huge impact for the entire industry. Tell us about your observations of the impact that the introduction of branded breath testing had on the industry.
There certainly was a sense of panic within the club. It was something where people didn't quite understand how it would work. And there was a logic to bringing it in. I mean, with hindsight now, it was a sensible move because the Australian culture of have as many beers as you like, then get in the car and drive home probably had to come to an end. With hindsight, it was also the beginning of hospitality venues, clubs and pubs and others, starting to meet more compliance issues because prior to that, it was probably a bit loose. So the initial impact was quite significant. But clubs and certainly Parramatta started to get their head around, well, there are ways to deal with this. Let's bring in taxi ramps. Let's bring in other transport means. And probably within about a year, things started to get back to normal. And as always in the industry evolves and Parramatta evolved.
Now, Danny, we'll go fast forward a few years to the late 1980s. You've become CEO for the first time at Guildford Leagues Club. Tell us about the psychological transition of stepping up into the CEO's role.
It's fair to say that you have a belief that you know what's required in the role. Then you get in the role and you discover all the things you don't know. Because what happens in an interview, your directors tell you one thing, you listen to that, you think, okay, this is what I'm going into, and then you turn up. And within the first couple of days, you realise the story that you had and the reality are two different beasts. It's not that there's anything wrong with that, but part of the journey is you have to learn what it is to be an executive manager. And that shift from an operational manager to an executive manager is quite significant. And not only the fact that you now have to understand what are all the long-term planning that you have to do, but how you handle the business today and how you get it to tomorrow. But you're also now dealing with a board and how you're reporting to that board. These are not things that you're trained at. So that initial experience at Guildford was quite a learning experience. I worked out fairly quickly that I had a fair few holes in my CV to fill. And I was lucky. My chairman was a gentleman called Ken Hurst. Ken was the deputy principal at Marylands High and also the maths master. And he had that ability to look at a problem and logic it out. But he also had the ability to take you on that journey. He was also very helpful on citation meetings because normally when someone would come through the door, the first thing they do is look at him and say, hello, sir. So you knew that it was a Maryland student. And he knew the club had to go in a certain direction and he knew changes had to occur. So he aided and abetted my experience journey as well in, one, focusing on the operation, but also thinking about tomorrow, property development, club development, looking at budgets, looking at strat planning. So Guildford was certainly a great learning experience, but also a great opportunity to get involved with junior league as well.
We talk a lot about mentors on this podcast. Ken's obviously one of yours. Are there any other names that stand out? There's obviously, it's been a very long career. Are there any other mentors that spring to mind?
Look, I've been very lucky. I've had a number of people in the New South Wales club market who have been great chairmen. I had Ken at Guildford. I started off with Neil Whittaker at Balmain, who was not only a great player in the 80s at Balmain, but also too very corporate. He was at that stage national salesman of Boral, and then went on to, running a consulting company. So not only a great mentor, but we became great friends. John Chalk then followed him. Now, John Chalk always referred to himself as the local plumber. Not many local plumbers were doing the sort of jobs John was, but, he had a paperboy mentality about him. He could talk to a Prime Minister on one hand, the garbage man on the next, and all were equal. So he was also a great mentor and a great problem solver. And he was a chairman who allowed you to do your job, but if things got tough, he was there. He was highly involved, similar to Neil, in the Super League war, because I fell right into the middle of it. 1st of April 1995, Super League hit. So I'd only been at Balmain 3 months. And I worked with an amazing person, Keith Barnes, who was a hero, but also a mentor. And Keith took on the operational role of the football, and I ended up taking over both roles of football club and leagues club. So I was learning as the days were going on, and, you've got Kerry Packer on one side, you've got Murdoch on another side, you've got Optus fighting Telstra on the other, you've got the Super League clubs, you've got it all happening, you've got media guys turning up wanting to do media interviews. It was a day-by-day learning experience.
And here you were running a foundation club, both the football club and the leagues club that supported it. At what stage did you realise this is absolutely unsustainable in the longer term, and that perhaps some of those older foundation clubs, Balmain included, may not have a standalone future?
You're asking a question that probably goes to the very heart of what happened. On one hand, no one emotionally ever wants to let their team go. Following a team like Balmain is tribal. You follow South Sydney. You don't follow it just because it's a good team and having a good year. You follow these teams because your family did. You lived in the area. It's tribal. So how do you then look at the reality of the business side? And what happened during that era, running a football club went from being $1 million plus a year to run to suddenly 4 million, 5 million, 10 million. Now it's, on a good year, 20 plus million. And luckily, Peter V'landys, with what he's done in rugby league, has been able to fund a lot of these clubs. But the reality is, rugby league at that time was unsustainable financially. And there were too many clubs in Sydney. There wasn't enough corporate. And in many ways, rugby league needed to expand to survive. That means change. No one likes change. So people like me had to look at the numbers and go, tomorrow has to be different. And really what we faced at Balmain, we were an inner city club that had multiple competitors. We had the casino, version 1, version 2. We were right in the middle of publand. Pubs had gone through having AADs and then suddenly having a few pokies, then having 15, then having 30. Then you had the groups coming in. There was never a day that stayed the same, and something like 45% of the area around us for 3 kilometres was water. So it was intense competition, and yet you had to find money for football and you had to find money to run the club. How do you balance it?
And there was a famous exchange on the Footy Show in which Phil Gould says, I think he even might have referenced you, Danny, saying that Steve Edmed was going to get $40,000 to re-sign for 12 more months at Balmain, but ended up taking, I think it was north of $350,000 a year to go up to North Queensland for 3 years. Surely at that point, many club bosses in Sydney were thinking, well, something's going to give here.
Well, it had to, and the Steve Edmed story was just the beginning of that story. Suddenly, player payments skyrocketed. And so a player who would be a basic player, who was probably playing for average wages, suddenly was finding himself on $150,000 to $200,000 a year because there wasn't enough quality players for all the clubs. And it was also the beginning of the era of the super manager, because now the player payments were such that if you were getting 5, 10 or 15% and you had a stable, you were making good money. So that period there, things were changing very fast.
Player agents still very much leaving their mark on the game in 2025. Getting back to Balmain Leagues Club and your tenure there, you moved on at the end of 2006, but obviously a very special place for you in your career as well. How sad were you to see that club essentially cease to exist with the coming of the Metro that never came? You know, we're still sitting here in 2025 without a Balmain Leagues Club. There does appear to be some light at the end of the tunnel, but personally, how disappointing is it to look at what's happened to Balmain Leagues Club?
It's certainly emotionally disappointing because it highlights the fact that there are so many issues within running a club and not all of them supportive. And I mean, one of the issues that clubs find are that council rules, development, opportunities aren't always easy. And sometimes it's not as simple as how do you move your business forward, is how do you deal with the politics in the area? And during that period, Balmain faced a big change within councils. It was the beginning of the Greens movement. And suddenly development and clubs were not anymore what you'd call the friends. It was the beginning of what we now see where clubs find themselves not always the favoured community friend. So Balmain, there's a whole series of issues that are quite sad. And should it have happened the way it did? Look, time and various issues worked against them. And not having a club there, I think, for that community is a great loss.
Well, fingers crossed we'll see some movement there in the years ahead. Sticking with Balmain, it was where you first came into contact with someone who considers you a mentor for them in Morgan Stewart. We had Morgan on the podcast a few weeks back and we talked about his time at Balmain Leagues Club, and he remarked that you had come to him with some unsolicited feedback about his personal style, saying, I think words to the effect of, you shut down as many conversations as you start. Morgan told us at first he found that quite confronting, but it actually led to a change in approach for him moving forward that obviously stood him in good stead. How do you approach having difficult conversations? It's not always coming from a bad spot. You're trying to get a good outcome for the individual involved, but how do you approach those difficult conversations?
That was something that became a learned experience, and to say that it came naturally it's not correct. I also had a journey in that area because being at Balmain for a little bit before Morgan came, we were starting to notice that even though we were moving forward, we were losing good people. And we spent a bit of time trying to figure out why. And we got some support. I had an operations manager then, Wayne Forrest, who had seen a woman called Roman Gasco, who was very much involved in human synergistics at the time, now involved in the leadership circle, who talked about values and culture and the development of the journey. And Roma took me on a journey, and part of that humanistic, synergistic process, to look at how I was impacting things, because sometimes you've actually got to look at what the issue was. And so part of it was me not understanding how I impact people, but also how I communicated with people. And part of that journey was then to understand how others impacted. So part of it was to learn how to have difficult conversations. Have conversations with empathy, have conversations to take the outcome forward, but also help that individual understand what their journey is on that. Because if you think about it, you get trained how to pull a beer, you get trained how to deal with a poker machine payout, but you actually don't get trained on how to interact with your fellow staff. You get promoted and you're expected to know the job. So if you're a good barman, you become a supervisor. Great. Being a good barman, is that the only skill a supervisor should have? It's about learning to handle people, but it's also learning what your impact is and what's the best way to deal with that impact. And in my case, I had a lot of learning to do. And as I developed those skills, part of the journey was when you sit with people. And Morgan really showed up as someone who had a good intellect, had a good heart, and was very driven to the point that you probably could say he was near on a missile. And the problem with missiles is when they finally land, it's not always a pretty picture. So you have a conversation not to say that you're doing wrong, but let's talk about your impact and what was your original intent. And Morgan had enough nous to go away and go, well, this was my intent. So how do I actually get that intent to occur? He worked with us on the journey, and he worked very much on, these are the values we want to live by in this business. How do we then move those values and impact the culture, and how does that culture impact the leadership? And he's certainly taken that on with what he's done all the way through his career. So he certainly espouses those values.
You talked about your own commitment to self-awareness and self-improvement. Now in your, I guess I don't want to make you feel old, but your 6th decade in the club industry, is that commitment still as strong as it was back in the 90s?
Well, it has to be. And even in the role that I've taken on at West down in Illawarra, I believe I've also changed again, because the people around you help change the style. You have to adapt. I mean, in some cases, some people don't always enjoy the style, and I mean, I've certainly been on a journey through the industry, and I've been lucky enough that in more places than not, I've fitted. But part of the journey for you is to look at your style, your values, and the culture you want to work in. Does it fit in that environment? You constantly have to evolve. Anyone who thinks that they can stay the way they were 10 years ago in the way that you deal with people are already behind the 8 ball. Because the other thing is the people we now work with, and a lot of people entering our business, come from a different set of values.
Let's fast forward to 2006. You're off to Panthers Penrith, looking after not 1, but 14 venues as the COO at that club. How big a shift was that from looking after 1 venue as the CEO to essentially being responsible for 14 right across New South Wales as the COO?
It was, again, another learn experience, because not only were you dealing with different venues, but you were dealing with different communities who had different wants. Port Macquarie had different needs and wants in its community and its advisory boards to Bathurst or Lavington or Hawkesbury or the guys at Epping or the guys at Cabramatta. So that was interesting as well, because it wasn't just a linear equation. And in turn, it was also how then you communicated that to your board, and you looked at the capital within the business, how you ran the business, and the financial impacts of the various. So it was quite a learn.
And during that time, we talked about the impact of the RBT earlier when you were at Parramatta, when you were at Penrith. You would have seen the introduction of the indoor smoking ban, the birth of exclusively outdoor smoking. Probably not quite as big an impact initially, but certainly it's had a long-lasting impact. Talk to us about that period.
That certainly was quite a difficult period, because also it was a difficult period for Panthers at that time, because they'd gone through the Temby inquiry, which had a big impact on them. And so even though they were a large organisation, they weren't in the same financial situation that they'd been prior to the Temby inquiry. The CEO at the time was dealing with significant debt, and he had plans on how he was dealing with that. So we had to be able to deal with the smoking issue not on 1 venue, but on 14 venues. So that was quite a journey, and the impact of it varied from venue to venue. It probably took the best part of 2 years to get ourselves to a point where we felt we had reasonable solutions.
Where do you think we're heading in relation to outdoor smoking?
I would hope that common sense is used, because at the end of the day, unless smoking is deemed illegal in any public space, you need to be able to look after the people who do enjoy smoking but also want to be part of your business. Having said that, you do need to provide environments that are safer both for the patron as well as the staff. So it's going to probably mean that if we are going to be allowed to keep smoking, we're going to have probably more appropriate areas to meet those needs and more appropriate processes and policy. I would not like to see it go, but on the same hand, we seem to be in a society that is removing things more than adding things in.
Let's look at your current role, because you've been at West Illawarra now for pretty much a decade, joined in 2015 as the CEO. Tell us about the challenges you've faced there over the years, because there have been some. There have been for every club in the state as well with COVID, but specific to West Illawarra, along with some of the achievements you're most proud of.
I think the easiest thing is to talk about where we sit as a club, and certainly we have a board led by Trevor Castle, who also has been there for over 20 years as a director and the best part of 20 years as the chairman. We have a board that really does believe in values and has supported management to drive the culture and the leadership. And so we really focus on being what we define as community strong. And that's something we're very proud of. We've gotten better in telling the story. We communicate very well with both our members outside the business and our staff, as well as the local politicians. But we've certainly had a journey. I mean, in 2015, we had Balmain Leagues, Port Kembla Golf Club, a motel, as well as West. Now, Balmain Leagues, Port and the motel had only joined us in 2014. Things were probably not economically at the best during that period. And by 2017, we had to make some hard decisions, and the motel and unfortunately Corrimal were part of that journey. Not easy. And change of that nature impacts everyone. But we were able to make sure that we kept the golf club, which was a major community asset. And we now have turned it around to the point that it's EBITDA positive. Still a way to go, but based on where it was in 2015, it wasn't washing its face. And West itself has now got to a point where we can handle quite a few bumps in the road if they come along. And we've really focused on things like sustainability, bringing in solar, looking at the efficiency of the business. But the bulk of what we do is the development of people. And I'm really proud of that. We have a good team and a good young team. I mean, I'm the old dog with young pups, and it's great. I mean, we have, right throughout the business, a lot of talent.
Was closing the Corrimal venue one of the hardest things you've had to do?
It certainly was not something I'd put on my CV as something I was happy with. But the way it was done, the way it was handled, and the way it was communicated, I was very impressed with how the team dealt with it and how the board approached the process. And at the end of the day, we also had the situation that we allowed a transition for the members to be involved with West, but also too, any of the staff that wanted to stay with us, we kept. So the impact itself ended up being constructive.
You're a self-described old doggy of the industry. I know you're considered to be a leader by many other people within the industry. Do you feel a strong sense of responsibility to the industry to ensure that we're well placed going into the future?
There was something at Parramatta that I've always remembered. If you're enjoying the water from the well, respect the people who dug the well. And anyone in a leadership role has to enjoy the fact that they've received a privilege running a club, because all those people many years ago who put the effort and time in to get that club to meet the needs of that community, to meet the needs of the people in that area, you have a responsibility to keep delivering it. And to do that, you need to be able to adapt and adjust to what's happening in your community, drive your business, but grow your people. And if I can leave the industry in a situation where the next generation can enjoy the sort of journey I've had, then I've done well.
What do you see as some of the big issues facing the industry, both medium and long term at the moment?
Medium is the ability to adapt with changing society, and it's changing very fast. One of the privileges I had was you had time to think. You could actually sit back and go, I've got 6 months for this, I've got a year for that, I've got 2 years for... You don't have that anymore. And so the hardest thing for the industry is the speed of change, both at government level, legislation level, technology, and expectation. I mean, the biggest change for everyone is mobile phones and the internet and the ability to go, did you just see what I saw? It's down the road. Why doesn't your club have that? And you guys are doing the perfect plate. And, you know, this club's got that and this club's got that. The patron now has instantaneous choice. And as a club, you've got to learn how to adapt. You've got to think, well, where do I fit? Because you can't keep changing to beat the Joneses, so you've got to decide who you are. Because once upon a time, being a golf club or a bowling club or a leagues club or an RSL was good enough. But now, you've actually got to be a very vibrant and flexible business that can adapt to the changes in your demographics. Now, that was never part of any training course. The other thing, long term, is the capital cost of running our businesses. Once upon a time, a budget of $10,000 did a lot. Now, a budget of $1 million barely gets you anywhere. Solar, for example, 10 years ago, people sort of thought about it. Well, the cost of power is now going to cripple businesses. Unless you're thinking about energy efficiency and sustainability, you won't be here in 10 years because you can't afford it. So the speed of change and what you've got to look at, the leaders in the industry have got to be able to have people around them to challenge them and challenge what they're doing. And part of what we've got to do as leaders is grow these people. The days of the guy leaning against the bar being the secretary manager, that's a long time gone. Skilled, with strong empathy, a real willingness to be part of that community and to make sure that that club is still in that community in 50 years is the leaders that you need. The industry needs to be here in 50 and 100 years because we're in an essence of the regions, but we have to be able to change to meet that goal.
What's your biggest fear for the industry?
That we haven't told the story of who we are and what we do well enough. We've allowed certain media groups to tell stories about who they think we are and what we do. and they've tried to make us about nothing more than gaming, when they've forgotten that gaming is part of who we are, and we got it because we were responsible, we had integrity, and it was the way the government could keep criminals out. Now, we can still provide all that, but that's not who we are, because those funds were used for the micro that the government in their macro view can't do. Those funds were to provide our communities and our people and our sporting bodies all the things that they needed that others couldn't provide. And it's only a small part of our business. So we need to be very good at telling the story of who we are as an industry, who we are as an individual clubs, and what we mean to the community.
Does it fill you with confidence, even though we have those sections of the media and others in the community who are critical of clubs, that net trust in clubs is still at record highs?
What makes me feel better is the journey that's occurred recently about the storytelling in the industry, and the fact that there's been a lot of work done through Clubs New South Wales and various clubs on getting better at telling the story. There's a large part of the media group that I probably don't spend a lot of time on because I don't really have respect for them on the way they act, but they do have access to voice. We just have to get better at making sure the story is balanced. I think people want their clubs, but we need to make sure everyone from our staff, our patrons and our community understand why we exist.
All right, away from work, where do we find you? What are your passions away from the club?
I'm a sad motorcycle person. It's my sanity moment. Two wheels are something that I quite enjoy. I have to say I've been riding probably for 50 years. Small break while the kids were young, but that's my sanity break. Spending time and travelling with my wife is something I quite enjoy. I do enjoy dining. As you can see, anorexia is not a problem. But, you know, there's a number of things that balance my life.
You mentioned your wife there. Tell us a bit more about your family broadly. I understand there's quite a few law degrees in the Munk clan. It
is fair to say there's not much enthusiasm for my career. My son's in London as a lawyer. My daughter's in Canberra as a lawyer. And my wife's a lawyer as well. And that's the other thing I have to thank the industry for. We've been able to take a journey with family, and she's been able to develop a career. You know, we were able to educate our kids, provide them a start. The bank of mum and dad turned out to be very useful. And the industry was a big part of that journey. And that's another privilege that I would hope others in the industry in the future have as well. Really, the industry has allowed me to have that family journey. And at the end of the day, it's never the money. It's that whole part of that balance. And family is a significant part of that balance. And I have to say, my wife, who also worked in the industry, and we met at Parramatta Leagues, so once again, the industry has to be thanked for that. She has understood what my journey has been in the industry, and that's allowed me to have the balance that I have, and has allowed me to have a career that I'm very grateful for.
Speaking of passions, it would be remiss of us not to talk about the CEO Sleepout, because you've been involved with this for over a decade. In fact, I think this year is your 11th CEO Sleepout. Why is this event so important to you?
Darren, I think I used the word privileged a couple of times, and I think my chairman, Trevor Castle, motivated me to enter in 2015. I really didn't understand it, but I did it because I was new to the job, and sometimes you do things to keep directors happy. But I suddenly discovered that what I knew about homelessness was the tip of the iceberg. And here I am, I worry about a car every couple of years. Do I have a motorbike? You know, where are the kids? Let's go out to dinner, all the rest of it. And there are people who don't even know where they're going to sleep. Or if they are, they're sleeping in their car. There was a story on the first CEO Sleepout, or the second. A woman had been living in a car for over 5 years, and her son, who was at primary school, was living in the car with her. And I'm sitting back going, I'm worrying about the wrong things here. And really, again, working in this great industry, this is an opportunity for me to give back and make sure that others share the privilege that I've had. And I have to say, it's hard to think in this great country and this amazing state of New South Wales that at any night there could be over 100,000 people not knowing where they're sleeping tomorrow. That's just wrong. And all of us have to get involved, because it's not right to ask government to solve everything. This is an us problem, not a them problem.
It is one of the great social challenges of our time. Now, people who want to help out, obviously they can support you in the CEO Sleepout. Where would they do that?
If they go on to the Vinnie CEO Sleepout site and just simply put in my surname, Munk, M-U-N-K, they'll find me there. They'll find the website to link into. But even if they just want to go to Vinnie's CO Sleep Out and put in their area, if they live in Coffs Harbour or they live in ACT or wherever, and they can donate to those regions as well, because one of the biggest things that Vinnie's is doing in certain areas is providing food vans. And the Wollongong food van goes out a minimum 3 times a week. And they've found themselves now under an increase of 45% of demand in the last 12 months. And that's after 50% demand increase the previous year. So it is something that we all need to get involved in. And someone like me losing one night's sleep is the least of our issues. If that can focus people to donate, then I have to thank, the team that I've got on the way they work for it. But really, our industry should be thinking this is something significant that we all need to get involved in.
All right, Danny, 3 quick questions before we go. We ask our guests all these same questions. Starting off with your favourite film. Have you got a favourite movie?
There's quite a few, but To Kill a Mockingbird probably always keeps coming up in my mind. It was a movie that certainly started some thoughts about the different impacts and what people face just because the colour's different or their dollars are different. And it was quite a movie that stimulated, and I still enjoy it. I've got to say, Gregory Peck was always a favourite actor.
Great actor and a terrific film as well, great and a great book. If you had a magic wand and you could fix one thing for the industry, what would it be?
I'd probably like to look at how we get our legislators to actually truly understand our industry.
Any ideas on how we do that?
None I want on record.
And finally, Danny, why do you think registered clubs, and you have touched on this, but why do you think registered clubs will still be around in 100 years' time?
They're intimate with the community. We create opportunities for people to feel safe, opportunities for people to meet other people, but also opportunities for people to change their lives. Because you have a chance to work in a venue and be skilled and actually have people take you on a journey. But clubs are intimate with their community. They touch the community and the community touches them. And in some cases, without that club in that region, something of the heart of that region is lost.
Danny, it's a great note on which to wrap it up. It's been a remarkable life spent in clubs, and that journey is not over yet. Thanks for talking to us today.
Pleasure, Darren. Thank you.
Danny Munk there, CEO of West Illawarra. And that's all we have time for in today's episode of the Club Life podcast. Thanks for your company. If you're a new listener, don't forget you can listen to our back catalogue of interviews. Catch up on clublife.com.au, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you're consuming this podcast. Search Club Life Podcast to find us, and make sure you subscribe so you never miss a new episode. If you have a suggestion on someone you think might make an interesting guest, get in touch with the team by emailing clublife@clubsnsw.com.au. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.